Hi everybody, it's good to be with you. Austen Ivereigh speaking from the UK, a place called Hereford near the Welsh border. I'm sorry for this rather strange position I'm in and the pained expression. It's because I am in a bit of pain, having put my back out last weekend. I've spent the week apologising to Anne-Marie for not doing this recording earlier. But anyway, I'm glad to be able finally to do it and to speak to this wonderful topic of synodality, specifically Pope Francis's vision. Anne-Marie should have sent you the paper, the article that I did for the CLC journal, upcoming edition on synodality. And what I'm going to do now is really speak around that paper, but I'm going to, it'll be a bit more sort of informal really and straightforward. And I just want to begin really here with the CLC and remembering my time with CLC Ivereigh in Buenos Aires in July 2018, when I was kindly invited to address the General Assembly. And I was I was fascinated in that in those few days with apostolic discernment in common, which of course was being practiced by the General Assembly. And as part of a preparation actually for an article which I wanted to write but never actually got round to, I asked various people at that meeting, different groups from different countries, about their experience of apostolic discernment in common. I remember I spoke, for example, to the Uruguayans about their discernment, their decision to take over the running of a Jesuit parish in Montevideo, and then I think it was in Korea or Malaysia perhaps, where a CLC group had decided to take over a school, for example, and the process of discernment that had led to those decisions. And I remember, as I asked them to describe the processes and the ups and downs and the kind of the messiness of it, that this was really the church. This is how the church is. It's the church's DNA. And you think of the way a pope is elected or the way a Jesuit general is elected, and that process of gathering together, of assembling, to ask, what is the will of God at this time for us and for our mission. This really feels like this is how the church really always has been or should have been. And that it's captured almost in the word church, isn't it? Ecclesia, as a kind of assembly, a gathering of the people of God to discern the Holy Spirit's will, the will of God. Symbolised, of course, or pictured rather, in the Old Testament, in that wonderful image of the tent of meeting in Exodus. Again, Moses going to hear from God, but the people gathering around the tent, to hear the answers. The people are always present. That's why I've called this talk and the article "The People of God in the Tent of Meeting," because it seems to me it captures that idea of assembly. And then, of course, famously, Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, the first, as it were, formal synod of the church that takes place. Again, that's the question that they ask, and that the way they answer that question is, it has seemed to us and to the Holy Spirit, that there's this search always for the will of the Spirit. I was just the other day attending a webinar, a really interesting webinar organised by the Tablet in the UK with Australian church leaders about their synodal process, which they're calling a plenary council, which has actually a specific canonical meaning. But it's I think one of the biggest synodal processes happening anywhere in the church at the moment. And, they began, they a couple of years ago, they began this process. And they began by asking people to gather in groups and to ask, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? So, we think of this when it happens, when we see it, we sort of realise that this is really what the church has always done, or should have always done. But why is it then that we feel that synodality feels new? There's this new springtime under Francis of synodality, and we've had the Synod of Bishops, after all, since the 1970s, the new modern version of the Synod of Bishops, reinstituted by Pope Paul VI following the Council. But so much we think of the church, don't we, as hierarchical, as authoritarian, as centralist, as top-down, as command and control. And we realise, of course, that this part of the church, this command and control church or form of governance, has risen in response to a kind of command and control mentality of modernity. So it's really the high noon of church centralism and authoritarianism is the 19th century, which is precisely when we have the sort of authoritarian nation states. So that we can immediately see that when the church, as it were, becomes much more authoritarian and rigid and centralist and so on, it is in reaction to, let's just call it modernity, but it's a fear of modernity, it's a fear of contamination, it's a defensive posture, which leads the church to react by abandoning, as it were, her synodality. So abandoning what makes her actually essentially Christian. And ironically, of course, ending up looking like the absolutist states which the church is reacting against. So I say that I mentioned this right at the beginning because I think it seems to me, when we're talking about the springtime of synodality under Francis, we have to keep this recent past of the last few hundred years at least in mind, because we are so much conditioned, the church has been so much conditioned by this centralist and authoritarian legacy. So when Francis said right at the beginning of his pontificate that he was determined to move slowly but decisively to implement synodality, he was embarking on a reform that was really about recovering the true nature or true identity of the church. And all true reform, says Yves Congar in that great book, True and False Reform in the Church, all true ecclesial reform is a recovery of something lost, or the recovery of the true or fuller meaning of something that has been dissipated or occluded over time. So Francis's restoration or reinvigoration of synodality, however you want to call it, is really a restoration in many ways of something that we have lost. So Francis has proceeded very decisively, as he said he would, along this path of synodality, also gradually and slowly, because he knows that this cannot be happen overnight. But he's done it mostly through in two ways. One is, of course, through the reform or the reinvigoration of the institution of the Synod of Bishops in Rome, about which much ink has been spilt in this pontificate. We've had the 4 synods, haven't we? The 2 family synods, Synod on Youth of 2014-2015, then we had the Youth Synod of 2018, and finally the Amazonia Synod of 2019. So, and there will be then a further synod on synodality in October next year. So this cycle of gatherings of the Synod of Bishops, which have become incredibly dynamic part of this pontificate, and that process has in itself generated a lot of reflection and a lot of change and a lot of innovation. So it's a process that he instituted. That's one way. And then the other way he sought to encourage synodality in the church is by using the Synod of Bishops in a way to model to the rest of the church the culture of synodality which he has encouraged. So above all, and famously in his kind of Magna Carta great speech of 17th of October 2015, when he spoke of how synodality is what he believed that the Lord is asking of the church in this millennium. That synodality, he sees this as this is God's will for the church, not just for the sake of the church, but for the sake also of humanity. Not just for the sake of the mission of the church to humanity, but for the sake of humanity itself. In other words, it is through learning and understanding synodality and demonstrating it that the church can offer a great service to a world which is, as we now know, particularly at the moment, deeply divided, polarised, tribalised, and conflicted. So we're already seeing the fruits of this embrace of synodality under Francis. Right now, I've mentioned the Australian process, the so-called plenary council, which began in it was agreed in 2016, and I think it began in kind of 2019, and then it was postponed in part because of coronavirus, but it's going on over many years. It's a big national process. And the other famous one at the moment that's going on is the one in Germany, which is called the synodal path, the German word for synodal path. But those are the two main ones. But then the Irish bishops, for example, are talking about having one. Their discussions are underway about an Irish national synod. And the Pope has been very explicit with the Italian Church in asking them also, remember that the Pope is president of the Bishops' Conference, and he's saying to the Bishops' Conference, we need to have a synodal process. And then the other example I want to give that's happening right now at the moment is happening at a very big scale, at a continental level, which is in Latin America. CELAM, the Episcopal body there, is organising what they call an ecclesial assembly, which will happen in November. That's more than 20, I think it's 23, 24 bishops' conferences from across the continent will gather, the church will gather, to mark the anniversary of the Parasida and to kind of have a synodal type assembly. Now this matters because a Parasida in 2007, as I've often said, is the kind of the fons et origo of this pontificate. In other words, the Francis pontificate is itself the fruit, as I say in the article, of a synodal process, which was marked very definitely in a Parasida by the most sophisticated, deep-seated signs of the times discernment that the Church has carried out, I think, anywhere in the world. There's been nothing like a Parasida, and that's been the motor of this pontificate and will continue to be, I think, the engine of future pontificates of this generation. And Francis, in that sense, marks the beginning of the Parasida era. So this is important because the pontificate is the fruit of a synodal process, the biggest in the world. Latin America has embraced synodality like nowhere else in the world. And of course that is now the gift of the Latin American Church to the Universal Church through Francis. As I quote in the article, Father Galli, that Bergoglio gave us a Parasida, now a Parasida gives us Francis. So Francis's promotion of synodality is the Latin American gift to the Church, if you like, a new springtime, which, if we can call it that, ushered in by a wind, from the south. Signs that the synodality is reshaping the Church. Of course, this is much harder to assess after 8 years, and one might say, well, there's no synodal process happening, in my church, not in the UK, not in the USA, not indeed in most churches. Although I think there are. I sense, at least I hear anecdotally, a lot of stirrings of sort of diocesan processes and people definitely talking about learning synodality. So there's definitely something stirring out there. But just to give you a couple of recent examples which have quite struck me of how things have changed in the Church. One of them actually is just from the other day. You'll all know about the CDF ruling. It was a document, a response to a question about the legitimacy of same-sex church blessings of same-sex couples, and the answer, of course, was no, and that's upset a lot of people. But one of the interesting reactions to that document, which was approved by the Pope, but I don't think the Pope kind of saw it. It certainly wasn't his language. Was Bishop Bonny of Antwerp in Belgium, who's a kind of well-known progressive bishop, and Bonny puts out this quite kind of long statement, and one of the interesting things he says there is that this document of the CDF, he says, does not reflect the Synod on the Family or Amoris Laetitia. In other words, it doesn't reflect the approach that was agreed by the Synod on the Family of 2014-2015. And I think I was very struck by this because if you try and imagine, here we have a bishop, in a sense, appealing to an authority that is beyond the Roman Curia. He's saying, look, the bishops agreed this at a synod. This is not reflected in this Vatican document, even though it was approved by Pope Francis. So I was just, so maybe a very little thing, but I was quite struck by it. The other thing I would say is that you again may remember this, if you're the kind of nerdy person who follows church news as I do. Spiritus Domini, the apostolic letter on women as acolytes and readers, which created a bit of a stir, as you know, was it a few weeks ago now. And the reason I mention that is that in that apostolic letter, Francis notes that, and I'm quoting here, a number of assemblies of the Synod of Bishops have highlighted the need to deepen the subject doctrinally so that it may respond to the nature of the aforementioned charisms and the needs of the times. Now, it's Rome speak, but interesting, isn't it, to say the bishops say we need to move along this path doctrinally, So one of the questions that's been raised by this synodality is, can synods change doctrine? And Francis in Let Us Dream in our book is saying very clearly kind of no, because doctrine is something that's settled, and what you're seeking to discern is, But on the other hand, it depends what you mean by doctrine, because clearly the church's doctrine does develop, and the synod can be a part of that, as Francis I think also says elsewhere in Let Us Dream. So this is of course what alarms a large number of people, about synodality, which, let's just call them conservatives for want of another word, who are fearful that this is a Trojan horse, that this will end up, collapsing the distinction between church and the world. In other words, it lets down the drawbridge. So, I began by saying that, of course, the anti-synodal forces in the church are essentially the forces of fear, the forces of defensiveness, the forces that want to keep the world at bay, and fear change, fear being sort of swamped or contaminated. And the resistance to the synods, the resistance to Francis at the synods has been one of the marked features of this pontificate. So, the dubia row in the following the synod on the family, but also just the general rumpus at the family synods. You think particularly of the Amazonia synod and the throwing of the statues into the river and so on. So it's quite fascinating to see how synodality, which has so marked this pontificate, has also been the locus of the greatest and I think most ferocious resistance to Francis. I've written about this for the journal The Way, the British Jesuit journal The Way, where I actually say that behind this resistance, I think, is a resistance to Francis discerning the will of the Holy Spirit on behalf of the Church. So that direct spiritual authority of the Church, I think, is of the Pope. Is really at question in these attacks. But so that's on the right. But then there's also, I think, a fair amount of resistance or disappointment with the synods and synodality from what one might call the left. And I'm sorry if these terms are too crude, but the what one might call progressives, people who want to see change. The other guys are the ones who don't want to see change. The progressives are the ones who want to see change. Let's just call them the left. And for many on the left, the synod seems to offer the prospect of long-awaited or long-expected change, only then to dash it. So there's a sort of sense of disappointment. And we saw this particularly over the Amazon synod, where the issue of the ordination of married men, viri probati, was discussed and was heavily discussed at that synod. And the synod voted in favour of it. The bishops voted in a majority to allow it in a very kind of limited way. And Francis basically chose not to implement it, or chose to ignore it, however you want to put it, to sidestep, I think was the expression used by a lot of the coverage. And that deeply disappointed a lot of people who said, well, there was a vote in favour of this, and the people of God were consulted, and the bishops discussed, and they came to a conclusion, they voted, why doesn't the Pope implement what they do? And then we have lots of explanations by certain commentators and theologians to say, well, Francis is, afraid of the conservatives, or he's afraid of moving too far too fast, or he's keen to appease a certain kind of wing. I don't accept these readings at all, and I think Let Us Dream makes very clear why Francis didn't proceed with the ordination of the Reaper Party. Not that he's saying that it won't ever happen, but he felt that it wasn't right to, because he didn't see the signs that the Holy Spirit wanted that. So for Francis, I'm convinced that the question, the only real question of any synod is the question that we are supposed to ask, which is, what does the Holy Spirit want? And he takes that question ultimately very, very seriously, to the extent that I think he feels bound as Pope to obey the Holy Spirit when the will of the Spirit is clear, and I think he feels equally bound not to move ahead if that will is not present. And again, I think in Let Us Dream that's all really quite well explained. Excuse me while I just reach for a copy, because I've just realised I'm going to need to quote from this in the course of this. So yeah, I'm thinking of particular commentators around Querida Masonia who warned about supporters of the Pope becoming disillusioned by his caution and by his reticence and so on. And I think this is essentially a political reading of Francis, which is reflected on the right. I mean, I'm thinking of a book by Ross Douthat you may have come across called To Change the Church. Ross, very well known in New York, conservative critic of the Pope, and particularly exercised, wasn't he, about the family synod, and writes this book called To Change the Church, in which he portrays Francis and a small circle of advisors kind of conspiring to change church teaching, but through these sort of elaborate mechanisms where it's not that excuse me, sorry about that, I normally wouldn't take a call, but it was just one of those calls that I had to take. I do apologise. So I was talking about Ross Douthat's book To Change the Church, and this kind of political hermeneutic, that there's this attempt to change church teaching by these devious sort of means, shrewd manoeuvres and so on. And there's been a lot of that around the synods in Rome, from allegations sort of from the right, but to some extent also from the left, where people are saying, oh well, this is what's really going on and so on. I think that's a bad lens with which to view the synods. Not to say that there hasn't a lot of shenanigans going on at the synods, there always are, but the way to understand Francis's approach to the synods, I think that the political hermeneutic is a wrong one. I think the right one is one that's very familiar to you, which is the Ignatian or Jesuit understanding of discernment in apostolic discernment in common. And I know you've heard a lot about this from Father General and so on, but I'm actually very struck by a 1986 letter from following General Congregation 33, a letter from the then General Kolvenbach to calling for this, and sort of 3 points that he makes there, which I find actually Francis has been making pretty much insistently from the beginning. The first is that this is the search for the will of God by groups. That's what in common means, who are committed to an apostolic work. So we have the idea of a body of people that has an apostolic commitment, that is itself, the group itself is the act of, that is the subject of the act of discernment. Very important point, because this is where you have the idea of the people of God is the agent of the discernment. Secondly, that they're essentially consultative in the technical sense of that word, meaning that the responsibility for taking the decisions that flow from the synodal process, the responsibility is reserved to the superior. That the purpose of discernment in common is to help effectively the superior, discern the will of God. So it's a way of assisting the superior in his own discernment. So that's why, to put this in a sort of cruder way, the Pope remains in the synodal process the chief discerner. He is the one who ultimately says, this is what the Holy Spirit is saying, and that authority, it seems to me, is very clear and very strong in Francis. He doesn't in any way devolve that ultimate responsibility. And yet he clearly has great faith in relying on the body's discernment for his own discernment, and that's really what what to govern synodally, I think, means. Thirdly, that it's not a question merely of weighing, different aspects of the question on a rational level. It's not a matter of simply of kind of rational discussion, but rather following Ignatius's own steps for a process of election. Seeking for true indifference, begging the light of the Holy Spirit, weighing motives according to gospel criteria, confirming choices, allowing temptations and attachments and so on to come to light, testing spirits. And this, I think, particularly matters in the church because in synods, because actually everybody will always appeal to those, to the good, the good of the church. They'll appeal to the gospel. They'll speak. They'll say the tradition says this. And everybody, of course, talking about the teaching of the gospel and God's will. I mean, nobody advances a view in a synodal context without appealing to those things, and therefore, in a sense, those have to be tested. That's not enough. We can't take things just at face value. So, if you look at the way Francis has conducted the synods in Rome, they've been very much guided, I think, by those three principles. And one of the things he's done at the end of each of the synod is he's given a wonderful speech where he's effectively unmasked the spirits involved. He's given his own discernment of the movements of the spirits involved in the synods. We have, of course, we have resistance. We also have tensions already appearing, as I talk about in the journal article. Tensions appearing in the synodal processes themselves about different people's understanding of what synodality means. And I think the classic case, or the case that I think gets people's attention at the moment, is Germany, where where quite a few bishops have been quite angry at the Vatican for what they see as preempting discussions. They believe they have a right to discuss universal questions, and particularly questions of governance. In fact, the whole kind of synodal process in Germany seems to be very much focused on the processes of governance in the church. And I mean, there are real tensions over the German synod. There's no question. The bishops called, the synod has been called to discuss the way power is exercised in the church, sexual morality, the priesthood, the role of women in ministries, and so on. Now, these things are all obviously proper topics for a synodal discernment, but they raise the question about the focus of the synod. What is that an apostolic purpose? And I think Francis, of course, has written a letter to the people of God in Germany, warning them about temptations, which we'll come on to. But clearly, there's a lot of tension over the German process. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Francis is allowing. I mean, he is allowing the process. He's very supportive, I think, of any synodal process. He's certainly been very supportive of the Australian one, because it's almost like he wants these things to happen, and we learn, as it were, on the journey, how to do it. That synodality has to be done, it has to be practiced, and it has to be reflected on for us really to understand how it works. It's not, in other words, a laboratory, something that can be learnt in a laboratory. So, I think actually what he's allowing is, we have these synodal processes going on, the synods of bishops in Rome, the National Synod, and I think October next year, when the synod will be on synodality, I think all these questions can be then brought together and discerned. And I think, if there's a moment in this pontificate where Francis might say, now let us thy servant depart in peace, it could well be that. I think synodality is so much at the heart of what he's been seeking to do. That is an important moment, a landmark moment in his pontificate. Why does Francis believe that it is the path of synodality which God expects of the church in the third millennium? Well, I think a big part of the answer to that question is in the 2018 International Theological Commission document, which is called Synodality in the Life and the Mission of the Church. which talks about how making a synodal church a reality is a precondition for a new missionary energy that will involve the entire people of God. So we have these two things. We have the missionary commitment, which comes out of a parousia, and we have the involvement or the activation of the people of God as an agent in the church, the protagonism, if you like, of the people of God. So the synodality, I think Francis' commitment to synodality in part flows from the discernment of the signs of the times that was carried out at a parousia, in which it was recognised that neo-Christendom is over, that the church can no longer depend on institutions, on culture and on law, to transmit the values of the gospel, but rather must, like the early church, rely on testimony, witness, the direct experience of the encounter with the God of mercy. And so in this vision, this is a Christianity which spreads, again, like the early church, as it were, from the people outwards. Of course, hierarchy remains important, the institution remains important, but it's the people of God who witness to who God is through their own experience of God as missionary disciples. So this is very much the language of a parousia. But I think what I'm hoping to get across is that the key link between the activation of that missionary discipleship of the people of God and synodality. One is a corollary of the other, because you can't ask people to take responsibility for mission unless they have also a say, unless they are able to participate in the processes which lead to the apostolic commitment. So through synodality, the church is enabling the gifts of the Spirit to be present in the people. Enabling the gifts of the Spirit that are present in the people to be expressed. Archbishop Mark Coleridge, Archbishop of Brisbane, talking about this at the tablet webinar, said he believes that this is a charismatic moment in the church where where the Spirit is showering these gifts on the people of God, but the structures of the church, or the culture, the mentality of the church, is still very much bound up with a previous model in which that's not the case. Bishop Mario Gretsch, the Maltese bishop who Francis has put in charge of the Synod of Bishops, who's very much a bishop, cardinal I should say, in the mould of Francis, he thinks like him about this. He said, Bishop Gretsch puts this rather well, the goal of the synodal process is to proclaim the gospel in a given context, to meet the particular challenges of the people living in that place. This is in his address to the bishops of Ireland. So there's a very specific objective of synodality. Now, I think there are some points of tension which have appeared already and which will continue to appear in this journey. Francis, of course, famously inverts the pyramid. We have a church that effectively in which the bishops are listening to the people. The Spirit is present in the people, the bishops. So you have this, the learning church and the teaching church are very much bound up together. So this process of consultation with the people of God is a key feature of synodality. Mauricio Lopez was talking about the preparation for the Amazonia Synod over 2 years. 60,000 people were consulted. There was a big consultation, not a very effective one, prior to the Family Synod. Australia process has begun with consulting apparently 220,000 people have all been asked to consider that question of what God is asking of Australia. So necessarily consulting the people of God is a messy experience. It throws up all kinds of things which run out of control and which seem to take things all over the place. And that's the period which, so there's an unsettling element. To some extent, synodality, the consultation of the people of God, puts the church into crisis in a kind of gospel sense of the word, forces the church to ask, what's going on here? Where's the Holy Spirit? A lot of people obviously dislike that uncertainty. Archbishop Coleridge, who was present at the Family Synod, described it the other day at this webinar. He said it was just all over the place. He had no idea. The participants in the Family Synod just had no idea where it was going at one point. It just seemed to be, all over the place. But he then said it was also the most profound experience of discernment he had ever had. And in my book, Wounded Shepherd, I tried to describe the family synod in some detail. It's slow, it's messy, so that's one point. Second sort of crisis element or tension element in synodality is that it's often synodality is often made necessary by a crisis of authority. So I was speaking earlier about this bigger crisis that the church is undergoing. And we've seen this in the clerical sex abuse crisis and the general crisis of authority in the church. So that both the Australia and the German churches are very conscious of this crisis of authority or credibility, which they're seeking to some extent through the synodal process to put right or to restore, so that they're really saying that their legitimacy or their authority can't simply be relied on anymore, that their true spiritual authority comes from their capacity to convoke the people of God in a process of discernment and to lead that process of discernment, and obviously then to act on it. So, but I think that in itself throws up all kinds of questions which then need to be resolved, and again which will make people uncomfortable. Questions about about consultation, democracy, who gets to be in the room when the decisions are made, and so on. These questions have already arisen in relation even to the Synod of Bishops. I mean, we know that a Synod of Bishops, it's the bishops who vote, and yet it's not that simple, because actually other people can be given the vote. And so then, we've had the question of why religious brothers can vote, but not religious sisters. So all those questions, I think, are raised. The governance questions are raised by the synods. A synod is, as it were, of the people, by the people, for the people, with the people, and that in itself raises the question of how you include people, how people can be included, and that in turn raises the question of how the ordinary faithful people of God, as Francis would call them, how they are able to articulate when they are not necessarily the most articulate of people. So, or to put this another way, how do we avoid synods being taken over by the wealthy, white, affluent, educated middle classes who have always got strong opinions about everything. Now, you can see this in the letter that Francis writes to the people of God in Germany. He's really warning them very, very strongly. He knows the German temptation, which is to get in there and everybody has a very strong opinion, and everybody, of course, has the answer. He warns that we can just end up, if we're not careful, in a how does he put it, in a complicated sort of game of arguments and disquisitions and resolutions which do no more than alienate us from the real and daily contact with the Lord's holy faithful people. There's this real fear, I think, that it becomes a middle-class talking shop, and that the people of God, who for Francis are the real protagonists in this, get left outside. And so that then raises the whole question of the spiritual qualities that are necessary in synodality, and there will be ones that you're familiar with from discernment processes. The importance of humility, not to preempt the answer of the Holy Spirit, the importance of not having agendas. People go into these processes sometimes saying, well, whatever else has to happen, this has to happen. Well, does it? Why does it? And so agendas. Very interesting in Let Us Dream, Francis at the end of part 2 talks about the disappointment with which many people responded to Querida Amazonia. And he says very interestingly, disappointment is, in this context, is not of the Spirit, because actually the Holy Spirit, as it were, has already poured out the gifts that the church kind of needs. So if you're disappointed that you don't get what you wanted, could it be that you're looking in the wrong place? That was your agenda, it wasn't the Spirit's agenda. But I think the great contribution of Let Us Dream is that I think it spells out very beautifully and very brilliantly those spiritual qualities that are necessary in a synodal process, and what it means to listen and to discern. And the great enemy of synodality is, as he says again in part 2, rigidity, the isolated conscience, that sense of superiority, that sense of the we versus the them, that we are in the possession of the truth. And you see this a lot in the synods, we have the truth, which leads to a kind of suspicion then of the body. So Francis is incredibly attentive and sensitive to signs of elitism, of a sort of elitist withdrawal from the people into these sort of elite groups who can very quickly take over a synodal process, which of course leads us to the last point, which is that synodality, synodal processes are not parliamentary processes. They're ultimately not political processes. In fact, if they are political processes, who cares, right? I mean, if that's all we've got, if the Holy Spirit isn't involved, then what are they? So here where I think is we enter into the really, really substantial part of synodality, which is the way the Holy Spirit can enter into processes of disagreement and even conflict and polarisation. So there's so much in part 2 of Let Us Dream on this, and I think it's some of the finest pages in the book. I think it's some of the most beautiful part of Francis' own thinking is on this question of contrapositions and what he calls overflow. So how we recognise, the way the Spirit works to break us out of this sort of narrow ways of thinking, polarised black and white, rigid ways of thinking. And he has some very interesting observations, well, interesting to me, of course, about the media and the way that the media's role in synods has often been to accentuate the polarisation because of this attempt to simplistically reduce everything to black and white, either or, because that's in kind of the nature of journalism. Journalism loves to simplify, and they like a straightforward fight. So the idea that the bishops are gathered in Rome to resolve the question of whether the divorced can receive communion, or resolve the question of whether married men can be ordained, that's it, that's the question. And on this side we have these people, on the other side we have those people. Rather than seeing it actually as a collective process of seeking the will of God together. In the course of writing the book, that I don't mind sharing with you that I did also point out to the Pope that it's not just the media who did this at the synods. There were a fair few bishops and cardinals who were, I think, contributing to that black and white approach. So the word that kind of comes to me about this is alchemy. It's the sort of the magic process of a synod. And again, I think Pope Francis is very beautiful in Let Us Dream about what he calls this sort of the creation of the harmony out of the cacophony, which is created by the Spirit. It's an action of the Spirit that creates a kind of reconciled diversity. It's not uniformity, and it's not mere sort of tolerant coexistence. It's something much more fertile, much more fruitful in this holding together of tensions, and as it were, allowing the Spirit to. I'm not kind of going into what he says in the book because I'm assuming that you've read it. Or you will read it. So I just want to really end on this point, which is a very Ignatian point, which is that, to me, synodality, the place to begin, this is a point actually Mauricio makes, is with the principle and foundation. That we are creatures called to be in a loving relationship with our Creator, with creation, and with our fellow creatures. Those are the 3 core relationships of our lives, and that it is a striking truth, as Francis says in Let Us Dream, that this is what he learnt from Guardini, that in creation, or in reality, there are no contradictions. There are tensions, there are things pulling against each other, but ultimately everything belongs together. There's a place for everything. Right? The only true contradiction is between good and evil, and that's not even. And that can't be a contraposition, as he says somewhere in there, because evil is a denial of the good, so it can't coexist. But in creation we have these contrapositions, these tensions, just as in our own lives and in our relationships. And they're places of tension. They're uncomfortable. They're painful, a bit like I'm in pain now. It causes us to shrink back and to shrink in on ourselves and all of that. But the gift of God, the gift of the Holy Spirit, is to allow us to live in and with those tensions and open us out to the action of the Spirit, in which the ruptures and the conflicts and the divisions of our world between centre and periphery and rich and poor and the ideological battles and so on, these can be healed, they can be redeemed, they can be reconciled, and that we come to this realization so beautifully expressed in Fratelli Tutti, that we are in fraternal relationship with each other. We are all one family under a loving Father, and that this is the reality, the truth of our fraternity, is what our madly individualistic, polarized culture seeks to conceal. Yeah. So there is a deception at the heart of our conflict, a deception at the heart of our polarization, which is the invitation to the experience of reciprocity, of mutuality, and fraternity, which is expressed ultimately in the church as a reconciled diversity, as a complexio oppositorum, a place where differences can be reconciled, brought into tension, and reconciled through opening us up to the action of the Spirit. So ultimately, synodality, just like Let Us Dream, is all about how we open ourselves to the action of the Spirit in our lives, in the lives of our community, and in the lives of our church. And I hope these remarks have been helpful for you to think about synodality. I'll just end really by saying that I think this is, as I said at the beginning, Francis's great contribution to the Church of the third millennium. I think that's how it will be seen by history. But I'm very aware, and I think he's very aware, that synodality is something we've got to learn how to do, and that we have to train people to do it. We have to teach people to do it. We have to do it. We have to reflect on it, and that starts at our own, parish levels, at the level of our CLC groups, of our diocese. Synodality is ultimately the DNA of the church, as I started off by saying, and you guys practice it so well, and I think there's a great call, there's a mission here, just as I was inspired listening to your stories of apostolic discernment in common back in Buenos Aires in 2018, and I kept feeling, well, gosh, more people need to hear this and learn from this. And I think that's what synodality is doing, that's what Francis is doing, and that's what you're doing. And just to wish you, all the best with that, and God's blessing. And thank you for letting me struggle through this through this talk in this way. I hope it's been useful, and I look forward to catching up with you in after this.